Plains of Cannae, southern Italy, August 2nd, 216 before Christ. While Roman consuls assembled the largest army in their republic's history, 80,000 infantry in traditional manipular formation, one Carthaginian general was arranging his troops in what Roman commanders called the positioning of amateurs. Hannibal Barca had studied military texts his opponents dismissed, Hellenistic tactical manuals, multicultural warfare techniques, flexible battlefield geometry that rejected rigid Roman doctrine. He positioned his weakest troops, 20,000 Gauls and Spaniards, in a forward bulge extending 200 yards toward the Roman line while holding his strongest African veterans back on the flanks. Roman tribunes exchanged glances and laughed. Consul Gaius Terentius Varro declared the weak center would collapse under Roman pressure, predicting victory by midday. Senior centurions nodded. They'd seen this mistake from barbarian armies before. Then the battle began. Roman legions advanced in dense formation, smashing into Hannibal's projecting center exactly as planned. The Carthaginian line gave ground, retreating step by step, while Roman commanders celebrated their obvious success. But as Romans pushed deeper into what they believed was a collapsing enemy formation, those dismissed African troops on the flanks began wheeling inward. By noon, 80,000 Romans found themselves completely surrounded in a killing zone 1,000 feet wide. Standard Roman tactics had walked them into the most sophisticated trap in military history. 50,000 legionaries died that afternoon, while Hannibal lost only 6,000. What did this Carthaginian commander understand about battlefield geometry and human psychology that Rome's greatest military minds had never considered? If you value stories of ancient tactical genius that rewrote the rules of warfare, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth discovering. The pre-dawn darkness of August 2nd, 216 before Christ, cloaked the plains of Cannae in southern Italy as Roman consul. Lucius Aemilius Paulus surveyed what would become the largest military formation in his republic's 700-year history. 80,000 Roman infantry stretched across the rolling countryside in perfect manipular order, their bronze-tipped pila glinting in the torchlight. Rectangular scuda shields creating an unbroken wall of red and gold that extended 2,000 feet from flank to flank. Behind the hastati in the front ranks stood the principes, seasoned veterans in their prime, followed by the triarii, gray-bearded warriors whose spears would serve as the army's final reserve. 6,000 Roman and allied cavalry anchored the wings, their horses snorting clouds of vapor in the cool morning air. Across the battlefield, separated by roughly 800 yards of open ground, stood Hannibal Barca's army of 50,000, a polyglot force that represented every corner of the Mediterranean world. Numidian cavalry from North Africa sat their small, agile horses on the left wing, their oval shields and bundled javelins marking them as masters of hit-and-run warfare. Spanish heavy cavalry held the right, their falcata swords and bronze helmets gleaming in the growing light. Between them stretched the Carthaginian infantry line, but as Roman officers studied the enemy formation through the morning mist, they began to notice something that defied every principle of sound military deployment. The Carthaginian center bulged forward in a pronounced convex arc, projecting nearly 200 yards toward the Roman line. 20,000 Gallic and Spanish warriors, the least reliable troops in Hannibal's army, occupied this forward position, their long Celtic shields and iron longswords clearly visible to Roman observers. These weren't the disciplined African veterans who had proven themselves in previous battles. These were tribal warriors whose battlefield experience came from raids and clan feuds rather than organized warfare. Behind this exposed salient, Hannibal had positioned his strongest units, 10,000 African heavy infantry on each flank, equipped with captured Roman armor and weapons from previous victories, held back in straight lines that created the appearance of a crescent moon when viewed from the Roman position. Roman military tribunes gathered around Consul Gaius Terentius Varro, pointing toward the enemy deployment with barely concealed amusement. The formation violated every principle taught in Roman military schools. Never expose your weakest troops, never create a salient that could be cut off and destroyed, never position your reserves where they couldn't immediately support the front line. Varro, representing the Popular Party's aggressive stance toward Carthaginian expansion, declared the positioning to be that of amateurs, predicting that Roman pressure would collapse Hannibal's center within the first hour of combat. Senior centurions who had fought Gallic tribes in previous campaigns nodded their agreement, recognizing the forward-positioned Gauls as the same undisciplined warriors they had defeated countless times before. The Roman battle plan crystallized around this apparent weakness. Standard manipular doctrine called for a frontal advance in 3 lines, with the hastati engaging first, followed by the principes if needed, and the triarii held in reserve. The dense formation would concentrate maximum pressure on Hannibal's obviously vulnerable center, while the superior Roman cavalry dealt with the Carthaginian wings. Once the center broke, which experienced officers estimated would take no more than 30 minutes, the Roman army would pour through the gap and roll up the enemy flanks from behind. Several tribunes openly joked that the battle would be decided by midday, with the army back in camp in time for the afternoon meal. What Roman commanders could not observe from their position was the precise calculation behind Hannibal's seemingly amateur deployment. The Carthaginian general had spent months studying Roman tactical doctrine, analyzing how consular armies responded to different battlefield situations, understanding the psychological pressure that drove Roman commanders to seek quick, decisive victories through overwhelming frontal assault. The forward bulge wasn't an accident or a sign of inexperience. It was carefully engineered bait designed to exploit Roman tactical orthodoxy and their absolute confidence in numerical superiority. Hannibal's military education differed fundamentally from Roman training. Where Roman officers learned standardized formations and rigid tactical sequences, the Carthaginian had studied the flexible battlefield geometry employed by Alexander the Great, the combined arms coordination perfected by Hellenistic kingdoms, and the adaptive tactics necessary to command troops from dozens of different cultures and military traditions. His army included Numidian horsemen trained from childhood in desert warfare, Spanish infantry who fought with curved falcata swords, Gallic warriors whose berserker charges had terrified Roman legions, and African veterans who had mastered both Carthaginian spearfighting and captured Roman techniques. The African heavy infantry represented Hannibal's master stroke of tactical preparation. These 10,000 veterans carried Roman scuda shields taken from previous battlefields, wore Roman mail armor stripped from enemy dead, and fought with Roman gladii that they had learned to use through months of training. To Roman observers, they appeared to be standard Carthaginian troops held in reserve, but in reality they were the most dangerous soldiers on the battlefield, warriors who combined African courage with Roman equipment and tactical knowledge gained through years of studying their enemies' methods. As the sun climbed higher and both armies prepared for combat, Roman confidence reached its peak. They possessed a 2-to-1 advantage in infantry. Their cavalry outnumbered the Carthaginians on both wings, and the enemy had apparently made their task easier by positioning weak troops in the most vulnerable part of their formation. The manipular system had never failed against barbarian armies. Roman discipline had never yielded to foreign tactics, and the Republic's military machine had never encountered an opponent who could match their combination of training, equipment, and battlefield experience. What they faced across the plains of Cannae appeared to be simply another barbarian army led by a general who had made fundamental errors in deployment that Roman tactical superiority would soon punish. The trap was set, though only one commander on the field understood the sophisticated engineering that would soon transform Roman strength into Roman catastrophe. The bronze horns of 8 Roman legions sounded the advance at precisely 9 o'clock in the morning, their deep notes echoing across the plains as 80,000 infantry began moving forward in perfect synchronization. The manipular formation maintained its precise geometry, hastati in the front ranks with their 6-foot spacing, principes behind them in checkerboard pattern, triarii bringing up the rear with their long spears held at the ready. The ground thundered under countless hobnailed sandals as the Roman war machine advanced at its standard rate of 2 miles per hour. Shields locked in an unbroken wall that stretched 2,000 feet from wing to wing. Hannibal's response began immediately on the cavalry wings. Maharbal, commanding 7,000 Numidian horsemen on the Carthaginian left, led his riders in a sweeping charge against the 3,000 Roman cavalry anchored on the enemy's right flank. These weren't the heavy cavalry favored by Mediterranean armies. Numidian horses were small, agile creatures bred for speed and endurance in desert warfare, carrying riders who had learned to fight from horseback before they could properly walk. Their tactics relied on mobility rather than mass, using javelin volleys and feigned retreats to break up enemy formations before closing with sword and spear. The collision between Numidian and Roman cavalry created a whirlwind of dust and violence that quickly moved away from the main battlefield as Maharbal's superior numbers and tactical flexibility overwhelmed the Roman horsemen. Simultaneously, Hasdrubal commanded 3,000 Spanish and Gallic cavalry against the 3,000 allied cavalry on the Roman left wing. Spanish genets rode larger horses than their Numidian allies, carrying round shields and wielding their distinctive falcata swords, curved blades that could deliver devastating cuts against both mounted and dismounted opponents. The Allied cavalry, composed primarily of Italian Soci troops with less training and inferior equipment compared to Roman citizens, found themselves quickly outmatched by the Carthaginian cavalry's superior numbers and tactical coordination. At 9:30, the Roman infantry front struck Hannibal's projecting center with tremendous force. Roman pila flew in dark clouds, their iron points designed to penetrate shields and bend upon impact to prevent enemy reuse. The javelins found their marks among the Gallic and Spanish warriors, punching through oval Celtic shields and into the men behind them. Roman gladi followed immediately as the hastati closed to sword range, their short blades perfectly designed for the close-quarters combat that Roman tactical doctrine demanded. The Carthaginian center began giving ground exactly as Roman commanders had predicted. 20,000 Gauls and Spaniards, armed with long swords and lacking the disciplined training of Roman legionaries, could not withstand the systematic pressure of 40,000 Roman infantry advancing in coordinated ranks. The forward bulge that had projected 200 yards toward the Roman line began flattening as Hannibal's troops retreated under the relentless assault. Celtic warriors fell back 3 to 5 yards every minute, their circular and oval shields providing inadequate protection against Roman tactical coordination and superior numbers. Consul Varro, commanding from his position behind the Triarii, watched the battle develop exactly as he had anticipated. His tribunes sent runners down the line with orders to maintain pressure and continue the advance. Victory appeared within reach as the enemy center collapsed under Roman superiority. The manipular system functioned with mechanical precision, each century maintaining its position in the greater formation while individual soldiers fought with the disciplined efficiency that had made Roman armies masters of the Mediterranean world. What Roman commanders failed to observe was the gradual transformation occurring in their own formation. As the Carthaginian center retreated in a controlled arc, Roman enthusiasm for pursuing what appeared to be a beaten enemy began concentrating their forces toward the center of their line. The original 2,000-foot frontage slowly contracted as troops on the flanks angled inward to join the successful assault on Hannibal's retreating Gauls and Spaniards. The Roman formation, designed as a broad rectangle to maximize frontage and maintain tactical flexibility, unconsciously began reshaping itself into an increasingly narrow wedge as soldiers followed the line of least resistance toward apparent victory. Meanwhile, the cavalry battles on both wings reached decisive conclusions that would prove crucial to the day's outcome. Maharbal's Numidians completed their destruction of the Roman right-wing cavalry, scattering the survivors across the countryside before disappearing from the immediate battlefield. Roman commanders assumed the Carthaginian horsemen were pursuing fleeing enemies or looting the Roman camp, standard behavior for barbarian cavalry after achieving tactical success. Hasdrubal's Spanish and Gallic cavalry achieved similar results against the Allied cavalry on the Roman left, overwhelming the Italian Soci through superior numbers and tactical coordination before similarly vanishing from the main battle area. By 10:30, Roman confidence reached euphoric levels as their tactical plan appeared to vindicate centuries of military doctrine. The Carthaginian center had retreated from its original forward position through a straight line and was beginning to bend backward into what looked like the preliminary stages of complete collapse. Roman casualties remained relatively light. The Hastati were taking losses from Gallic longswords and Spanish falcata, but nothing approaching the catastrophic casualties that would indicate tactical failure. The Principes remained largely uncommitted, ready to exploit the breakthrough that seemed imminent, while the Triarii had not engaged at all. The critical detail that escaped Roman observation was the behavior of Hannibal's African heavy infantry on both flanks. These 10,000 veterans, equipped with captured Roman armor and weapons, had remained stationary throughout the cavalry battles and the initial infantry assault. To Roman commanders focused on the collapsing center, the African troops appeared to be standard reserve formations held back from the main engagement. What they could not see from their position within the advancing Roman wedge was that the African units were beginning subtle movements that would soon transform the entire tactical situation. As the Roman formation advanced another 100 yards into what they believed was crumbling enemy resistance, the geometric relationship between the two armies underwent a fundamental shift. The Romans had pushed so far forward in pursuit of victory that their flanks were no longer parallel to the Carthaginian line. They were beginning to extend past the ends of Hannibal's retreating center. The African heavy infantry, no longer facing the Roman front but positioned near the Roman flanks, began the precise wheeling movements that would soon reveal the true sophistication of Hannibal's tactical engineering. The trap was closing, though Roman commanders remained focused on the retreating enemy directly in front of them, convinced that complete victory lay just minutes ahead. Marcus Minucius, a Roman tribune positioned with the Hastati on the right side of the advancing formation, first noticed the change at 11 o'clock when he glanced left during a brief lull in the fighting. The African heavy infantry that had remained motionless throughout the morning's combat were no longer standing in their original positions parallel to the Roman advance. Instead, these 10,000 veterans were beginning to wheel inward, their front ranks turning 90 degrees to face the Roman flanks, rather than maintaining their original orientation toward the Roman front. What had been reserve formations held back from the main engagement were transforming into attack columns aimed directly at the sides of the Roman wedge. The geometric reality of the tactical situation became clear to those few Roman officers with sufficient battlefield perspective to observe the larger pattern. The Roman army, originally deployed in a formation 2,000 feet wide and 80 ranks deep, had compressed itself during 90 minutes of pursuit into a dense column roughly 1,000 feet wide and 120 ranks deep. Their enthusiastic advance into Hannibal's retreating center had carried them nearly 400 yards forward from their starting position, creating a Roman salient that projected deep into Carthaginian territory, while the enemy flanks remained intact and increasingly threatening. Hannibal's African troops represented the finest soldiers on the battlefield, veterans of campaigns across Spain and southern Italy who combined traditional Carthaginian military training with captured Roman equipment and hard-won knowledge of Roman tactical methods. They carried the rectangular scuda shields taken from previous battlefields, wore the mail armor stripped from Roman dead, and fought with gladi that they had mastered through months of practice. More importantly, they understood Roman formation weaknesses that came from the manipular system's reliance on frontage and depth rather than all-around security. The wheeling movement began with mathematical precision that revealed the sophistication of Hannibal's tactical planning. The African units on both flanks executed synchronized turns that brought their spear points to bear on Roman soldiers who had no space to maneuver within their compressed formation. Roman density in the advanced positions reached 60 men per 100 square yards, creating conditions where individual warriors could barely turn to face threats from unexpected directions. The manipular system, designed for frontal combat against similarly organized enemies, provided no doctrine for responding to simultaneous attacks from three directions. At 11:15, the African assault struck both Roman flanks with coordinated timing that demonstrated months of preparation and training. These weren't the disorganized tribal attacks that Roman centurions had faced in previous Gallic campaigns. The African advance maintained perfect formation discipline while delivering spear thrusts with surgical precision against Roman soldiers who could not effectively respond. The captured Roman equipment proved its value as African warriors fought with weapons and armor identical to their enemies, eliminating any material advantage that might have compensated for Roman tactical disadvantages. The compressed Roman formation became a liability as soldiers on the flanks tried to turn and face the African attack but found themselves pressed against their own comrades. Roman tactical training emphasized maintaining formation integrity above individual combat effectiveness, but the doctrine assumed enemies would approach from predictable directions that allowed coordinated responses. Legionaries who attempted to wheel their maniples to face the flank attacks discovered that the dense formation prevented effective redeployment. There simply wasn't sufficient space for traditional Roman tactical responses. Simultaneously, the Carthaginian center ceased its systematic retreat and began fighting back with renewed intensity. The Gallic and Spanish warriors who had given ground for 90 minutes suddenly stood firm, their long swords and falcata proving deadly against Roman soldiers who had expected continued pursuit rather than determined resistance. The Celtic warriors, fighting now with the confidence that comes from executing a successful plan, no longer retreated 3 to 5 yards per minute, but held their positions while their African allies struck the Roman flanks. Consul Paulus, fighting with the Triarii in what he had assumed would remain the rear of the formation, found himself engaged in desperate combat as the tactical situation deteriorated with shocking speed. His orders to expand the flanks and redeploy maniples to meet the African attack could not reach the front lines through the chaos of three-directional combat. Roman military communications, designed for linear battles with clear front and rear areas, broke down completely when the enemy appeared on 3 sides simultaneously. The killing zone that emerged from Hannibal's tactical engineering measured approximately 1,000 feet wide and 600 feet deep, with Roman soldiers packed at densities that made effective combat impossible. Men in the exterior ranks faced outward against Carthaginian spears, while those in the interior could not reach the enemy and found themselves crushed between their own advancing comrades and the press of soldiers trying to fight in all directions. The Roman gladius, requiring 2 to 3 feet of fighting space for effective use, became useless when wielded by men packed at 8 to 10 per square yard. Roman casualties mounted at approximately 1,000 men every 10 minutes as the systematic slaughter began. Consul Paulus fell fighting in the press, along with 80 senators who had joined the campaign and 29 military tribunes who had led the morning advance. The Roman chain of command collapsed as senior officers died in combat they had not anticipated, leaving centurions and individual soldiers to fight without coordination or tactical guidance in conditions that favored neither Roman training nor Roman equipment. Desperate attempts by surviving Roman units to fight their way out of the encirclement met carefully prepared Carthaginian responses that demonstrated the thoroughness of Hannibal's planning. The African heavy infantry adjusted their formations to contain every breakout attempt while maintaining steady pressure that prevented Roman reorganization. The Gallic and Spanish center held firm against Roman attempts to retreat, creating an impermeable barrier that forced the compressed legions deeper into the killing zone where effective resistance became impossible. By noon, organized Roman resistance had collapsed into individual acts of courage that could not influence the tactical outcome. The army that had advanced confidently into what appeared to be a weak enemy center now found itself completely surrounded in a space too small for effective deployment, attacked simultaneously from north, south, east, and west by enemies who dictated the terms of engagement. The geometric perfection of Hannibal's trap had transformed Roman numerical superiority into fatal vulnerability, proving that understanding battlefield mathematics could overcome any advantage in numbers or individual fighting ability. The distant thunder of 10,000 hooves announced the return of Hannibal's cavalry at 12:30 in the afternoon. Their disciplined formations appearing on the horizon like storm clouds, gathering for a final devastating strike. Maharbal's 7,000 Numidian horsemen and Hasdrubal's 3,000 Spanish and Gallic cavalry had completed their systematic destruction of all Roman and allied mounted forces, scattering or killing every enemy horseman who might have escaped to carry word of the unfolding disaster back to Rome. Now they returned to close the final side of the tactical trap, that had transformed the largest Roman army in history into a compressed mass of desperate soldiers fighting for survival in an increasingly shrinking space. The cavalry charge struck the Roman rear with calculated precision, hitting troops who had assumed their backs remained secure while they fought the three-directional assault that had already claimed thousands of their comrades. Roman soldiers in the rearmost ranks, many of whom had not yet engaged in serious combat, suddenly found themselves facing Numidian javelins and Spanish falcata swords from behind, while African spears pressed against them from the sides, and Gallic longswords awaited them to the front. For the first time in the military history of the Mediterranean world, an entire consular army found itself completely surrounded with no possibility of retreat or tactical reorganization. The mathematical precision of complete encirclement created conditions that no Roman tactical manual had ever contemplated. 80,000 soldiers, originally deployed across 2,000 feet of frontage, now occupied a killing zone measuring roughly 1,000 feet by 600 feet, achieving population densities that approached 10 men per square yard in the center of the formation. The physical laws governing human movement and combat effectiveness broke down as Roman legionaries found themselves unable to lift their shields, draw their swords, or even turn their bodies to face the enemies attacking from all directions. Roman gladi, engineered for the close-quarters combat that characterized Mediterranean warfare, required a minimum of 2 to 3 feet of fighting space to deliver effective cuts and thrusts. Packed at densities exceeding 8 men per square yard, Roman soldiers could barely move their arms, much less execute the sword techniques that had made their legions masters of Italy. Many legionaries could not draw their weapons at all, trapped in a press of bodies that rendered individual fighting ability meaningless, regardless of training, courage, or equipment quality. Carthaginian forces attacked from outside the Roman press using spears and javelins that could reach their targets without requiring the attackers to enter the crushing density that paralyzed Roman response. Numidian horsemen rode along the perimeter of the encircled formation, hurling bundle javelins into the packed Roman ranks while remaining beyond the reach of any effective retaliation. African heavy infantry thrust their spears systematically into the Roman flanks, withdrawing the points to strike again without exposing themselves to gladius counterattacks that the compressed Romans could not deliver anyway. The systematic slaughter that followed demonstrated the horrifying efficiency of Hannibal's tactical engineering. Roman casualties mounted at rates approaching 100 men per minute as Carthaginian forces worked methodically around the perimeter of the trapped formation. Ancient historian Livy would later describe Romans piled upon Romans as the killing continued, with men in the rear ranks pushed forward by cavalry attacks while those in front were pressed backward by infantry assaults, creating a human compression that killed soldiers through suffocation and trampling even before enemy weapons found their marks. Consul Paulus died fighting in the press, along with 80 senators who had joined the campaign to witness what they expected would be a glorious Roman victory. 29 military tribunes fell in the slaughter, along with hundreds of centurions whose leadership had made the Roman military machine function with mechanical precision during the morning advance. The command structure that had coordinated 80,000 soldiers in perfect manipular formation collapsed as senior officers died in conditions that rendered rank and experience meaningless. Individual acts of courage emerged from the carnage as small groups of Romans attempted desperate breakout attacks against their Carthaginian captors. Some units of hastati, drawing on their training in aggressive forward assault, tried to cut their way through the African heavy infantry using concentrated charges that might have succeeded against conventional enemies. Others attempted to fight their way back toward their starting positions, hoping to find escape routes that no longer existed. Every breakout attempt met carefully prepared Carthaginian responses that demonstrated the thoroughness of Hannibal's tactical preparation and the discipline of troops who maintained formation integrity while executing a complex four-directional assault. The physics of battlefield compression created a cascading collapse that accelerated as the afternoon progressed. Romans who fell wounded could not be evacuated through the packed formation, creating obstacles that further impeded movement and combat effectiveness. Dead bodies piled up in windows that channeled survivors into increasingly restricted spaces, where Carthaginian weapons could reach them more easily. The Roman formation, originally engineered to maximize offensive capability through coordinated advance, became a death trap that concentrated targets for enemy attack while preventing effective defensive responses. Weapons became useless not only due to space limitations, but also because of the psychological breakdown that accompanies systematic slaughter under impossible conditions. Roman soldiers, trained to fight as part of coordinated units with clear tactical objectives, found themselves isolated in a press of desperate individuals with no tactical guidance, no possibility of mutual support, and no hope of victory or escape. The military morale that had carried Roman legions to dominance across the Mediterranean world evaporated under conditions that no amount of training or battlefield experience had prepared them to face. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the killing zone contained more corpses than living soldiers, as Carthaginian forces continued their methodical work around the perimeter of what had once been Rome's most formidable military formation. The tactical masterpiece that Roman commanders had dismissed as amateur positioning 6 hours earlier had achieved casualty ratios approaching 10-1 through the simple expedient of controlling where and how the battle would be fought. Hannibal's engineering had transformed Roman strength into Roman vulnerability, Roman numerical advantage into fatal overcrowding, and Roman tactical confidence into the foundation of military catastrophe on a scale that would be remembered and studied for the next 2,000 years. The killing finally ceased at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when no organized Roman resistance remained on the battlefield, leaving behind a scene of destruction that would redefine military science for the next 2 millennia. Carthaginian casualty reports, meticulously recorded by Hannibal's staff officers, documented approximately 6,000 dead from his polyglot army, losses distributed primarily among the Gallic and Spanish infantry who had absorbed the initial Roman assault during their controlled retreat. Roman casualties told a vastly different story. Between 50,000 and 70,000 dead, including Consul Paulus, 80 senators, 29 military tribunes, and hundreds of centurions who had led the confident advance that morning. The mathematical precision was staggering. Hannibal had achieved casualty ratios approaching 10-1 through tactical positioning alone, without superior numbers, better equipment, or technological advantages. The immediate aftermath revealed the thoroughness of the tactical vindication that Roman commanders had never anticipated. What they had dismissed at dawn as the positioning of amateurs now stood exposed as military engineering of unprecedented sophistication, every element serving a calculated purpose in a plan that had anticipated and exploited Roman tactical psychology with scientific precision. The forward bulge that had appeared to offer an easy target had been designed to create maximum penetration depth while maintaining Carthaginian control over the rate of advance. The African flanks, positioned to seem like poorly placed reserves, had been calculated to execute wheeling maneuvers at precisely the moment when Roman formation density would prevent effective response. Surviving Roman officers, many wounded and fewer than 10,000 in total from an army that had numbered 86,000 at dawn, found themselves confronting tactical concepts that challenged fundamental assumptions about warfare itself. The consul who had declared Hannibal's formation amateur was dead, along with most of the tribunes who had predicted easy victory by midday. Those few who lived spoke of battlefield geometry they had never encountered in Roman military education, of enemy movements that seemed to anticipate Roman responses with uncanny accuracy, of tactical engineering that had transformed their greatest strength, numerical superiority, into the instrument of their destruction. News of the catastrophe reached Rome within 4 days, carried by the handful of cavalry survivors who had escaped during the initial stages of the battle. The Senate, which had confidently dispatched its largest army to crush the Carthaginian invasion, now faced potential collapse as reports filtered in describing the systematic annihilation of 8 legions along with their allied contingents. Italian cities that had remained loyal to Rome began sending envoys to Hannibal's camp, calculating that Carthaginian victory was now inevitable and Roman power permanently broken. The military doctrine that had dominated Mediterranean warfare for over a century, advance in dense formation, overwhelm with superior numbers, rely on individual Roman courage to overcome tactical disadvantages. lay shattered on the plains of Cannae, along with the soldiers who had embodied it. The strategic implications extended far beyond a single battlefield defeat. Rome's military system, built on the premise that disciplined infantry advancing in manipular formation could overcome any opponent through sustained pressure and numerical advantage, had been systematically dissected by an enemy who understood Roman strengths well enough to engineer their transformation into fatal weaknesses. Hannibal had proven that conventional tactical wisdom could be made obsolete by innovative thinking that worked with human nature rather than against it, exploiting the psychological pressure that drove Roman commanders to seek quick, decisive victories rather than patient, methodical campaigns. The tactical innovations demonstrated at Cannae immediately influenced military thinking across the ancient world. Greek historian Polybius, writing within decades of the battle, analyzed Hannibal's methods with the systematic approach of a scientist studying natural phenomena. Roman military writers like Vegetius would later incorporate Cannae's lessons into doctrinal manuals that emphasized the dangers of tactical overconfidence and the importance of understanding enemy capabilities rather than dismissing unfamiliar methods as primitive or amateur. The double envelopment technique, using a weak center to draw enemy forces into a trap where stronger flanks could attack from both sides, became the gold standard for tactical achievement that future generals would study and attempt to replicate. The battle's influence on military education proved remarkably durable across centuries and cultures. Julius Caesar studied Hannibal's methods during his conquest of Gaul, adapting encirclement principles to Roman tactical doctrine while avoiding the overconfidence that had doomed his predecessors at Cannae. Medieval military theorists incorporated the battle's lessons into treatises on warfare that emphasized the importance of battlefield geometry and psychological understanding of enemy behavior. Renaissance condottieri analyzed Cannae's tactical mechanics while developing combined arms techniques that could achieve similar results with contemporary weapons and formations. Modern military academies continue to require study of the Battle of Cannae as a fundamental lesson in tactical innovation and the dangers of underestimating unconventional approaches to warfare. Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz identified the battle as a tactical masterpiece that demonstrated the supremacy of intellectual preparation over material advantages. During the Second World War, German panzer commanders applied Cannae principles to encirclement operations that achieved similar results on vastly larger scales, with the 1941 Battle of Kiev trapping 665,000 Soviet troops using tactical concepts that Hannibal had pioneered over 2,000 years earlier. Archaeological investigations of the Cannae battlefield, conducted using modern scientific methods, have validated the accuracy of ancient historical accounts while revealing additional details about the mechanics of the encirclement. Bone concentrations match Livy's descriptions of the killing zone's location and dimensions. Weapon fragments confirm the density of combat and the types of arms used by both sides. Coin evidence tracks the movement of different military units across the battlefield, supporting ancient descriptions of the tactical sequence that transformed Roman advance into Carthaginian victory. Scientific analysis has proven what Roman commanders learned too late. Hannibal's formation was precisely engineered for encirclement and annihilation, representing military science rather than amateur positioning. The fundamental lesson of Cannae transcends its immediate historical context, demonstrating that dismissing unconventional tactics as primitive or amateur can prove fatal when those tactics represent sophisticated understanding of principles that conventional wisdom ignores. On August 2nd, 216 before Christ, 80,000 Roman soldiers discovered that superior numbers mean nothing when deployed according to predictable patterns that innovative enemies can exploit through superior tactical engineering. Hannibal's deliberately weakened center wasn't the product of ignorance. It was military science that achieved the impossible by understanding human psychology better than his opponents understood themselves. In one afternoon, using tactical principles rather than superior force, Hannibal inflicted on Rome the worst military defeat in its 700-year history, forever proving that in warfare, intelligence matters more than strength.